In today's lesson, we are going to talk about completing the square and solving quadratic equations by completing the square. So first we talk about the square root property. So to basically get rid of an x squared on both sides, we square root both sides. So here we have an x squared plus 15. Then we square root both sides. Remember, when you square root, you have a plus or minus, because both positive and negative 15, root 15, I apologize, can equal, if I square both of those, I'm going to get 15 out, is what I'm trying to say. Okay, so our first example. So since the x squared is just kind of alone, there's nothing inside the x squared, we just leave it as is, and we isolate it just like it was an x. So I subtract 11 from both sides. And I get 4x squared is equal to 48. And then I divide by 4. So again, isolate that x squared. So I get x squared equals 12. And then we square root both sides, and I get x equals plus or minus root 12. Now you know me, okay? If you don't know me, I like things in simplest radical form, which means that we need to pull out any perfect squares that are locked underneath that radical. So 4 is a perfect square that goes into 12. 4 times 3 is 12. 4 is a perfect square and breaks out to become 2 root 3. So another one where we have to solve the equation using the square root property. Okay, so you kind of know what you have to do in this one, get the directions. Because I have this using the square root property, what they're telling me there is hopefully this left side of my equation can factor to a perfect square. And it does. This factors to x plus 6 squared equals 28. Now we square root both sides. Don't forget your plus and minus. So I have x plus 6 equals plus or minus root 28. Now again, simplest radical form. 28 is 4 times 7. So then the 4 breaks out and becomes a 2 and becomes a 7. 7 underneath the radical. Now the 2, it's 2 times root 7. The 2 doesn't go in front of the plus and minus, because when I subtract now this 6 over, that's what goes in front of that. Okay, so multiplying this out. So if I have x plus b times x plus b, use FOIL. First, outer, so first terms together, outer terms together, plus inner terms together, plus the last terms together. So notice what you have here. We have x squared plus, I have 2 of those middle terms, plus b squared. So I have this term here is twice b. I need to figure out, we now want to go backwards, I guess. I'm going to give you an expression like we have down here. And I need to figure out what I need to add in here to get a perfect square trinomial. So this middle term, this 6, I have 2b is equal to 6. So if I have to take and I divide that term by 2. So I take my b term and I divide it by 2. Okay, that gets me this piece here. I know I'm using the same variable so I can see where it might be confusing. And then we have to square it. So I take 6 divided by 2 and square it. So I have 3 squared which is 9. So that's a 9. Now this factors to x plus 3 squared. The square root of whatever that number is. That 9, that last term we added in. So complete the square for each expression, write the resulting expression. So I take my 14. I divide it by 2 and I square it. It doesn't matter if I take the plus or minus because when I end up squaring it, a square of a negative is still going to be a positive. So I get 7 squared, which is 49. And then that factors to x squared, same sign in the middle, the square root, if I could do it correctly, the square root of the number, and there's no squared there, the square root of the number I just found, all to the squared power, all to the second power. So now on this other one, I take 9 divided by 2, and I square it. Well, that doesn't simplify it all. So that's 81 over 4. So I add in 81 over 4. So now this factors to x plus the square root of this number, or 9 over 2. Now, what is that getting us to? That is getting us to how we solve quadratic equations by completing the square. Okay, collect all variables on one side and constants on the other. It's needed to sides by a to make the x squared term 1. Okay, so this term in front of the x squared has to be 1. Complete the square by using b over 2 squared. Add that to both sides of the equation. It has to stay equal, has to stay the same. Factor the variable expression as a perfect square. Take the square root of both sides. Solve the equation for the values of the variable. Okay, so collect all the variables on one side. So I am going to collect the x squared minus 12x on one side. I'm going to leave the negative 20 on the other. My coefficient on a is 1, so I don't need to do the second step. I figure out my b, which is negative 12 divided by 2 squared. That's negative 6 squared, 36. I add that to both sides. What I do to one side equation, I do to the other. Okay, that goes back to like solving equations. The left side, I tell my students we've rigged the problem. We've made the problem so that it works out a certain way. We've made it so that it factors to that. The other side of the equation, we simplify and we get 16. Then we square root both sides. So I get x, I'm not going to take away that parenthesis, x minus 6 is equal to plus or minus 4. Then I add these 6 over, so I have 6 plus or minus 4. One of my biggest pet peeves as a teacher. Students leave it like that. What's 6 plus 4? Well, that's 10. 6 minus 4, that's 2. Those are my two answers. Solve by completing the square. Okay, so variables on one side, everything on the other. I like to have my variables on the left side. So I am going to add this 2x squared over, and then I have a 16x. I am going to get this 22. I'm going to subtract that over to the other side. Now, since my coefficient on x squared is 2, I divide each and every term by 2. Now, I take and I do 8 divided by 2 squared. Well, that's 4, that's 16. I add 16 to both sides. What I find is students forget to add it to both sides. Add it to both sides. We've rigged the equation. X squared minus, no, there we go. X squared minus 4 quantity squared. I've rigged the problem. It factors to that. It has to. Then I have negative 11 plus 16. Well, that's a 5. I square root both sides. And then I add the 4 over. The 4, remember, goes in front of this plus or minus.